YouTube afterwards, so you can come and look afterwards. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Terry O'Sullivan to us today, who's going to talk about assessing MOOCs for credit. And we're all very interested in what MOOCs can do for us, and how people learn with MOOCs, and how maybe they can be tasters to bring people into our university to take full-time courses. So I'll hand over to Terry. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Denise. Can I just start by saying how absolutely delighted I am and how privileged I feel to be standing here, because over the last few years I've found this seminar series a real inspiration personally in terms of how I've been thinking about my teaching. So thank you very much indeed for those marvellous people that organised it, and it's great to see you here. Thank you very much, Steve, for coming. I want to talk about the theme I've got here is assessing MOOCs for credit. So it's perhaps it's going to be a little bit technical at times, but I'm hoping it's going to visit some wider issues about, as Denise was saying, what our expectations of MOOCs might be as an industry. MOOCs don't stand still for very long, though. Even in the time that I've been involved with them, particularly with FutureLearn, FutureLearn has kind of repositioned itself, and it even to some extent changed its business model. And this story also features some changes along the way, the most important of which was probably the decision to try and find a way of awarding MOOCs for credit. That's not what we started out doing, but that's what we have ended up doing. So that, in a sense, affects the narrative. Here's the overview of what I'll be talking about. I'm going to give you a bit of history, first of all, because of the importance of understanding the story so far. And then I'm going to talk about some of the difficulties attendant on an aspiration to award credit for learning in MOOCs. The very shorthand that we use as a university to describe this initiative, MOOCs for credit, makes me feel uncomfortable, because it's not the MOOCs that generate the credit. It's the whole package of the learning in the MOOCs and the assessment that the student undergoes within the university. And it's the assessment that generates the credit, literally. So I'm going to talk about some solutions then, 3 different solutions that might be possible to assessing and awarding credit for MOOC learning. And then I'm going to explain why we chose our solution and tell you a bit more about it. And I'm going to finish with some thoughts about whether it's working or not. Still early days, I keep telling everybody. And then it would be great if we could turn this into a discussion session. I don't know if it's possible for people who are watching online to offer up questions.
No,
apparently not, that's a shame.
Email you afterwards.
Okay, but if you would like to email me afterwards, I'll be very, very interested to talk to you. If you want to get together for a coffee, either face-to-face or virtual, I'd be very, very interested to talk to you. I'll talk for ages to anyone about MOOCs. So, how we got here. In 2014 or so, the university made some money available under the Strategic Development Fund to make a lot of MOOCs, basically. We wanted to inject some product, if you like, onto this FutureLearn platform, which had been going, since 2012, 2013. And the thinking was that we could create a large number of MOOCs very quickly. The original idea was 10, and these were known from the outset as revenue MOOCs. And the reason they were called revenue MOOCs, they're still called revenue MOOCs by the cognoscenti, is that they were seen as potential sources of quite a lot of income if we managed to attract large numbers of learners who would also be prepared to pay for what were called in those days statements of participation. Because an important motivator for doing MOOCs is to show some continuous professional development, and the evidence for that, that FutureLearn offers anyway, is in the form of digital statements of participation, or more latterly, certificates of achievement. And you can stick these on your CV or your LinkedIn profile or whatever. the most popular MOOCs for this kind of activity, as you might expect, are MOOCs that demonstrate business skills or coding skills or professional skills of some sort. So CPD was a big market. We wanted to get a share of it through this, what looked like this, and it is, a very exciting new channel. So we set to work in the Faculty of Business Law on enterprising spirits as we are, and we put together a package in response to the funding, including a 2-year post for a director of MOOCs programs. That was me. I was lucky enough to get the job. Really, really good fun for 2 years. And we set out, as I say, to make 10 MOOCs. And the idea was we were going to make 2 MOOCs in association with the Chartered Management Institute, the CMI, under the title of Management and Leadership. And this would be allied to content on their Level 5 qualification curriculum. So that, in a sense, we were anticipating a lot of interest in that. They have been very, very successful, actually, because they've now been combined with an assessment vehicle which the CMI own and run, and they've attracted literally thousands of learners and hundreds of people going on to taking the assessment and getting that Level 5 qualification or Level 5 award. We also did 8, if you like, of our own MOOCs in the business school. 4 we wanted to pitch at Level 1, so to speak, and they were called the Employability MOOCs because we were trying to target key skills. And the combination we came up with were sort of business communications, business networking, for which I was the lead educator, so I may go on about that if you're not careful. Customer engagement or marketing, and also project management. Project management is probably the single most popular MOOC topic out there, actually. It's very, very well represented on the MOOC landscape. For reasons which I won't go into in this presentation, we subsequently increased that number of 4, if you like, Level 1 level MOOCs to 8. We had to do that rather quickly, so we ended up making 14 MOOCs, where we had said we were going to make 10, which was quite an achievement, actually, I must say. People did work extremely hard. The MOOCs I want to concentrate on in this talk are the 4 digital economy MOOCs that we also made. And they were pitched at, if you like, postgraduate, post-experience level. So whereas the employability MOOCs were aimed at people that might be thinking about going to university or just starting university or thinking about getting a job in an early stage of their career, the digital economy MOOCs were aimed at experienced managers in much the same way as a qualification like our MBA would be. And the topics we chose there are supply chain management, marketing, sales, and finance. And I took the decision to try to align the actual, if you like, the disciplinary content in each of those subjects to what we were already teaching on the MBA, so that I could be certain that we were trying to strike the right level with those MOOCs. Because MOOCs are so radically open, we can't stop people from doing them. So it's quite difficult, in a sense, to talk about a master's level MOOC because we don't insist on prerequisites. The content of all these MOOCs took account of guidelines from various industry lead bodies and authoritative institutions. I'm just trying to say that it wasn't just snatched out of the air because we thought it was a good idea. And in particular, the employability MOOCs do address what are acknowledged to be employability issues in the UK and elsewhere. So I'm very proud, actually, of what we've achieved with those MOOCs. After we'd started on this enterprise, there was a decision taken to add value through finding a way to accredit the learning through MOOCs. And this is where the idea of MOOCs for credits was born. And one of the things I want to leave you with from this presentation is the idea, as I say, that MOOCs are a dynamic process and that they kind of exist in a historical sequence. And what was happening in 2014 or so was that MOOC platforms who had started in a blaze of glory and taking higher education to the masses were really struggling to find a business model to sustain themselves. So in America, for example, edX made a very, very high profile alliance with Arizona State University and started offering what they called the Global Freshman Year. So if you did a series of MOOCs on edX and then you took a series of paid for assessments with the University of Arizona State University, you could then effectively achieve the kind of learning you get in year one of a US degree at a fraction of the cost. Although actually, when you actually look at the detail in the small print, that involves a lot of hours online, far, far more hours than we were talking about with our programs here. We had come up through experience with 4 weeks at 3 hours per week as, if you like, the sweet spot for MOOCs, the one that maintains most retention. And that's worth bearing in mind, because one of the disciplines, one of the constraints on what we were trying to do for MOOCs for credit was just simply how little time the students had to study in their MOOCs because of the relationship that you'll be familiar with between learning hours, or study hours I should say, and credit values. So I want to sort of develop that in the next slide, which is the challenge of credit. As we know, UK academic credit is dependent on a number of things. Now, MOOCs are what are known in the literature as non-formal learning. In the Open University, for some reason, we tend to call them informal learning. But strictly speaking, if you look at the literature on these things, informal learning is kind of stuff you might pick up from the telly, so we are involved in that, definitely. But non-formal learning is a bit more formal than informal learning. It tends to be packaged into things like courses or programs, but it doesn't have the same kind of infrastructure, the formality of, let's say, a university degree, which exists in kind of an institutional framework and is subject to all sorts of checks and balances. So it's non-formal learning, and dragging non-formal learning into a formal learning system is quite a difficult thing to do when you sit down and think about it. First of all, as I say, UK academic credit is dependent on institutional frameworks. We have QAA with various accreditation bodies, we have our peers, we have the government, we have to be absolutely, we now have the Office for Students, we have to be absolutely sure that what we are offering as credit will actually stand up to scrutiny. Secondly, as I hinted at a moment ago, MOOCs are also, credits I should say, are also a quantitative indicator of learning. The number of credits you can achieve is related to the study hours in a program. They're also a qualitative indicator of learning. We have credits at different levels. We have M-level credits and undergraduate level credits, for example. So one of the challenges we had with the MOOCs for credit as far as the master's program was concerned, the postgraduate digital economy program, was to make sure that we could demonstrate that the package of MOOCs plus any assessment we were carrying out would actually stand up as master's credits. Credit is also generated by assessment, what we call controlled assessment. In an exam, that's a kind of archetypal example of controlled assessment. You know who you're dealing with. Students bring along their identification. You can see them at it. They're not allowed to, well, in some exams they are allowed to refer to materials, but generally speaking, it's a test of their understanding and to some extent their memory, but it's a test of them as individuals, and that's what the controlling is about. And as a result, credits are also awarded to identified individuals. So this idea of being sure that the person doing the study is also the person taking the assessment and being rewarded with credits is quite an important one in terms of how we habitually think about credit, but it's kind of challenged by the massive nature of MOOCs and the way in which it's kind of difficult to establish anybody's identity out there for certain. So that gave us quite a challenge, actually. And the final thing I'd say, and this is a kind of difficult point to get across perhaps, but credits are made available by organisations such as universities which need to sustain themselves as businesses. And so this explains to some extent the path we took in terms of how we made credit available from the learning on MOOCs. Because we had to have some kind of sustainable outcome for that. We had to get, it's not exactly a sustainable outcome, an outcome that promoted our sustainability. We had to establish an income stream. FutureLearn also had to establish an income stream. So that does answer some of the questions about why we went the particular way we went. Because we could have gone a number of different ways. Here are 3 ways we could have done the business, or started the business, if you like, of awarding credit to MOOCs. First of all, and I think when we started, I don't want to second guess Peter Horrocks, I never actually had a direct conversation with him when I was MOOCs program director. It was always mediated through the senior management of the faculty. It's probably a good thing. But I think his dream was that we could do it all on the platform, and certainly FutureLearn themselves were always keen in the discussions, can we find a way of doing this all within the platform? But the options for assessment within MOOCs are quite limited. MOOCs are very good at assessment for learning, and some of our MOOCs and the programs I've mentioned offer excellent examples of review quizzes or peer review exercises or interactive exercises where students have to do things to demonstrate and develop their skills. And these are all automated. It's fantastic what you can do with this technology. I think it's fantastic what you can do with Moodle as well. But with MOOCs, because of their massive nature, the automation is a necessary part of the deal if you want to keep them free or you want to keep the fees very low. You can, obviously, introduce tutor-marked assessment, and this might have been a path we could have taken for fee. In fact, that, that could have been a path we could have taken. But in fact, the model we finally evolved isn't that different from that. It's just that the assessment takes place outside the MOOC within the Open University's learning environment. We could perhaps have subjected learners to exams at assessment centres. FutureLearn have a relationship with Pearson, for example, whereby it would have been possible to do that. But exams are not what we see as the most user-friendly form of assessment, and particularly because of the aspiration to use this program, the digital economy program, as a way of fishing for new students out there in the MOOC universe. We felt that wouldn't be a very attractive proposition, and it also introduces quite a lot of costs. Second path is, if you like, the accreditation of prior learning, where MOOCs themselves are prior learning. And our external assessor on BXM 871, Dr. John Talbot from Chester University, the reason I invited him to take on the role was I saw a seminar he presented to CICP here in the Open University in 2016, where he actually reported his own research on how MOOC learning was being assessed, largely by work-based learning departments who perhaps think outside the box more than traditional universities do, and largely through the accreditation of prior learning. Although he did say to me that one of the problems was just getting a sufficient mass of MOOC learning to be able to assess it, a coherent and sufficient mass to be able to assess it in each individual. Internally, we have examples of assessment vehicles that could have been used as well. I worked for a while on a rewrite of the module U810, as did my esteemed colleague Liz here, who's taken over as MOOC Supremo in FPL, lucky woman.
Is that a promotion?
Well, it's certainly not a sideways move. It's more like a shove, I think.
Yeah.
The continued professional development and practice, and that actually expected learners to bring in about 150 hours of extant continuing professional development, so they had to evidence in some way. We couldn't just take it on their say-so. And then in the 150 hours of the module itself, they were taken through a series of theoretical frameworks, and they had to do 3 assessments whereby they reviewed what they'd done already, they made sense of it through a theoretical framework about learning, which they chose from a number we presented with them. And the final TMA was a reasoned plan for how their CPD would develop in the future. It's a very, very nice, elegant model, actually, which we could have used. And indeed, I can't for the life of me remember the module code or the name. I was looking for it this morning, and it was so difficult to find information on the university.
YXM130.
Sorry?
YXM130.
Thank you very much indeed for that. YXM7130. Fantastic module. I've been to at least one of their module meetings, might have been more than one, I can't remember. We were trying to establish a kind of a network between them and what we were doing, a similar module in the business school. But that has a similar kind of approach to just getting people to offer up the MOOCs they have done, whatever those MOOCs are, and make sense of them within the module through various theoretical frameworks. And it also, because it's a level 1 module, it gives them an astounding grounding in study skills development. But the way we went was probably the least flexible of any of those, being the Open University, what we should expect. We actually opted to create a tailored assessment vehicle. In fact, we've created 2 to match the 2 programs of MOOCs, one at undergraduate, one at postgraduate level, which I mentioned in the introduction. But the one I want to concentrate on is BXM 871, Managing the Digital Economy. Okay, so I now want to tell you why this is such a great solution, in spite of its complexity, in spite of the fact it almost drove me crazy. Because a tailored assessment vehicle, which was targeting specific MOOCs rather than asking people to bring in general MOOCs and make sense of them, satisfied all of the criteria that I mentioned in terms of the challenge of MOOCs at the beginning of the talk. So we knew, because we were experienced at making modules, that what we did would adhere to an institutional framework associated with formal learning. So we put our assessment modules through the entire quality assurance process, both for approvals for the modules and also for the production of the modules. So, for example, we had the expert services, a very, very useful and collegial contribution from John Talbot from Chester, and gave me a lot of very useful advice. Because we went through the OU learning design process, and we made sure that our module-directed and student-directed time allocations were right, we were confident that we could actually demonstrate that the assessment vehicle and the MOOCs together were worth the credits involved. We also were keen to ensure that master's level skills were embedded in the module. It's quite an ambitious thing to do, but I can point to where we are offering up theoretical frameworks and where we're offering up, in particular, assessment skills, both in terms of being assessed and also of assessing, which helps you to understand the process of being assessed, assessment skills at master's level to these students, even though it's a relatively short module. There's a lot going on in this module. It's extremely good value for money. Now, I said that credits were generated by a controlled assessment, such as exams. In our move to end-of-module assessments, or EMAs, as you know, the question of identifying the student, or verification, as we call it, is handled by the student's own tutor, usually being the first marker. So they sign a statement to say, yes, I'm convinced this is the student's own work. Now, in order to make our assessment vehicles sustainable, we had to minimise their production costs and their presentations costs, so we have dispensed with the tutor. Our reason for this is that even though it seems counterintuitive, because these MOOCs were envisaged, or these programs of MOOCs were envisaged as ways of attracting new learners into the university. So learners like that you feel could really do with a tutor to hold their hands. However, we convinced ourselves that because these new learners had actually achieved the requisite number of certificates of achievement, they must be pretty, in Alison Littlejohn's term, self-regulated learners. They must be pretty independent, and therefore we felt they could survive without a tutor, but with the services of a learning advisor. And the way we wrote the assessment modules was to try and get the software to do the teaching, and to make the activities, for example. I mean, I'm very proud actually of some of the work in BXM 871 in terms of how the software itself kind of anticipates the need for feedback that normally a tutor might provide in a face-to-face or online tutorial environment, and actually gets the student to think through what is right or what is wrong with a piece of work. Okay? I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So, in terms of a control assessment, in terms of verification, just to loop back to that for a moment, we didn't have a tutor to verify. So we actually, after a lot of discussion, we came up with, if you like, a compromise, which was to design an assessment whereby the student would have to submit a piece of written work very early in the module. And then when we compared that with the main assessment that they submitted at the end, we could then have some grounds for confidence that the student was the same individual. Now, even as I say that to you, it doesn't sound very convincing, but when I started thinking about our traditional sort of gold standard approach to assessment, to control assessment, you still can never be absolutely sure. You could have people faking ID documents and sending a ringer to an examination, for example. So I'm able to sleep at nights with this verification model. And that also covers the awarded to an identifiable individual characteristic that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you.
The final thing I want to mention is that this solution satisfies the need for the organisations involved to sustain themselves. It coincides with the business model that FutureLearn were operating. So the assessment can only assess learning from the specified MOOCs and the programs. That means that the learners, if you like, pay as they go by purchasing certificates of achievement. We share the revenue from those certificates of achievement with FutureLearn. Secondly, the assessment module itself, rather like U810 actually, is a real bargain compared to what you'd pay for standard credits at master's level. It's something like half the price actually. I shudder to think of it. If you're doing a master's degree at the Open University and you're online, sign up now. But that was because we felt that we wanted people to dip their toe, if you like, into the world of master's level learning without too much financial risk, which seems to me to be crippling higher education at the moment. There's so much about taking on debt. And the final thing, the sustainability from the Open University's point of view, was that we were committed to low-cost production, even though I was involved, and also presentation. So, for example, one characteristics of the BXM 871, and indeed of the other assessment module that we're using to address the undergraduate level MOOCs, is we've got extensive use of open education resources. And obviously we don't have a tutor on either of them to minimise the presentation costs. Okay, so I hope that's convinced you that of those three ways of assessing and granting credit for MOOCs, i.e. in MOOC assessment, accreditation of prior learning, and then tailored assessment targeting specific MOOCs, the third was the better option. So I tell you, at times I used to think, are we completely barking up the wrong tree? Because we were doing this in quite a tight timescale. We had to take decisions which we then couldn't go back on. And we had long discussions with FutureLearn right at the beginning, where I certainly started feeling as if I was being a terribly fuddy-duddy, kind of stick in the wood, self-interested, reactionary academic. Perish the thought. But it's interesting to reflect that when Sebastian Thrun, found, one of the MOOC kind of pioneers, when he tried to get automated assessment for some kind of qualification approved by the management team at Stanford. According to an article in Wired magazine I read while I was preparing this, he went through no fewer than 15 meetings with senior Stanford management and their lawyers before he could actually get even a statement of participation approved as some kind of, you know, if you like, it's not credit, but it's some kind of credential, if you like, for participation in that MOOC. So in a sense, we were rehearsing the same kind of argument here, but in the UK QAA framework, we have to be even more conservative. So at least, clunky though this might appear to be, and you probably will think it's clunky when I show you the next slide, nevertheless, it ticked all of those boxes. So, let's go to that slide. The learner journey. I also said the user journey there. I'm not quite sure whether to call future learn folk users or learners. I think we call them learners now. But this is the program, if you like, the MOOCs program that they do. And this therefore is the prior learning that's assessed over here. They do 4 MOOCs. They can do them in any order. As I mentioned before, they last for 4 weeks. There's 3 hours learning per week. You can actually double up. So the presentation pattern does allow you to do a couple of MOOCs simultaneously. They're presented 3 times a year. They're not presented continuously. That's the difference between, let's say, a MOOC and a BOC, an Open Learn. A BOC is always there when you want it. But the downside of that is that you do it largely on your own. With a MOOC, you've got a cohort of other learners to go through it with you, and that's the great advantage of social learning. You can actually discuss the concepts and make the concepts your own with other learners. So you do this 16 hours, or 16 weeks, in fact 48 hours of MOOCs learning, both directed through the MOOC that you're studying and also in your independent reflection, so that's 48 study hours altogether. And then you're accepted in, if you can brandish to our satisfaction 4 certificates of achievement, you're accepted into the Open University Assessment module, BXM 871, which runs twice a year. And of course we get some turbulence, let's say, at registration from learners who've got 3 certificates of achievement but haven't quite got the 3rd, and the MOOC starting the same week that the assessment vehicle is starting, and can they stretch it a bit, this sort of thing. It would have been impossible to plan, I think, to avoid that actually, and still have the open availability of the MOOCs as we wanted them to be, and also to coincide with our internal patterns for assessment within the university. But basically, that's the general idea. You do the pre-existing study hours, and then you come into the module where you get supported skills development and your own independent learning, and also preparation for the assessment. So, just add a little box here. Yeah, this is where the credits, this is where the magic happens. This is where the credits are earned and awarded. And I'll just talk about, in a bit more detail, about what goes on in the module in the next few slides, but basically, to summarize it, is the consolidation of the students' learning from these 4 MOOCs, which they may have studied at different times in different orders. It's the integration of the learning, because each MOOC addresses a separate topic, and to be truly master students, I felt they needed to have more of an integrated view of their learning. This is one of the differences, for example, between Stage 1 MBA and the studies that precede it. Stage 1 MBA tries to integrate the disciplines in management. Plenty of study skills support, particularly concentrating on assessment, but also trying to develop some elements of criticality in the students. So while we remain true to not giving them any more disciplinary content to be assessed on than they have learned in those MOOCs, in order to, if you like, to skill them up to be master's level students and to be able to survive assessment at master's level beyond this module, which could be the first module they do at master's level, we wanted to be sure that we're actually giving them an insight into what's needed at master's level, and so criticality was something we wanted to develop in them rather quickly. So in a sense, what we were trying to do was go to, I'd call it 0 to master's survivor in 29 weeks. So that's the 16 weeks in which they study the MOOCs, which might be a lot more than 16 weeks, depending on the study pattern that they engaged with. And then 13 weeks for the module itself, the assessment module itself. So just to reiterate, the aim of the module is threefold: to assess the learning from the MOOCs so that we could accredit it. But in order to do that at master's level, to integrate it using theoretical frameworks, disruption was the key one, really. We looked at theories of technological change, human capital, and then finally we looked at the work of Utterbach and Christensen. And Christensen, if you like, is the arch-mage of disruption. His book, The Innovator's Dilemma, which was published in the late 90s, is like kind of required reading in Silicon Valley. And we used an article that he'd written in 2015, published in Harvard Review of Business, as, well, an extract from it as a reading to get the students up to speed on what disruption meant. And I was also keen, from the integration point of view, and addressing them as not just as students but as managers, to give them some kind of perspective on how difficult it is to get these different functions that they might have learned about separately to work together. So we used a relatively recent, not terribly recent, reading from Schutz and Bloch, representing research that was done in Germany about what they call silo mentality in organisations. And I thought it was a very, very accessible reading. That we gave them that, you know, in its entirety actually via the library. And they responded very well to that, actually. They enjoyed that. I think some of them, they varied in their appreciation, if you like, of the importance of the technological change and the disruption material for all the popularity of digital disruption as a buzzword. But some of them got a lot out of it. I'm looking at the assessments that they wrote, some of them did get a lot out of it. We also wanted to give them a practical context for application of what they'd learned in the MOOCs to help consolidate it, but also to make it useful to them as managers, because I really do believe that we should be in the business of improving people's skills at work and making them more successful as managers, so whatever success means. So we gave them a case study called Noble Systems, which we obtained for nothing from the internet, a particular journal for the purpose. I had to change it slightly to remove the occasional swear word, oddly enough, and not like me at all. And then we also wanted them to apply their learning to their own context, which, as we all know, students are often very reluctant to do. But again, I was trying to hammer home this idea that this should not just be an academic exercise, it should be useful to them. And finally, we wanted to demonstrate that we were supporting the development of master's level study skills. Obviously, the critical thinking skills should be accelerated by getting a theoretical framework around the story. But in particular, I was trying to prioritize assessment skills. So let's just have a look at how it plays out. Sorry, this is a really boring slide, but this is, if you like, how the 13 weeks of BXM 871 are spent. First of all, we have an introduction and we have some study skills activities which we tell them, keep coming back to these study skills if you need to. And while I was assembling this week from the various wonderful resources that are available online from the Open University to support our student study skills, I kept thinking, do people really take notes when they're studying online? I was just wondering whether what we're telling students at the moment about their studies, because I'm sure we're updating it all the time, how relevant it is to our students right now who are studying so much online, so much on the move, using devices perhaps we don't even understand properly their potential. But I was very, very keen in this first week to get them thinking about something called informed judgment, which is an idea I borrowed from David Bood, now in Australia, but previously at the Open University, where he makes the point that perhaps the most important thing we do with students at university is to teach them to be assessed and to assess. It's a really, really important life skill. And I've summarised his reading about this, and I also gave them an extract from it. I'm not sure how many people really connected with it. A lot of them were scratching their heads, wondering why they had to read about this kind of thing, which seemed very academic, literally the nuts and bolts of academic practice, in this course that was about managing the digital economy. But I hope it became clear later on in the unfolding of the module. We then got our teeth into technological change theories, and I tried to be as imaginative as possible in using things like YouTube videos, short extracts, my own summaries of things, and activities, above all else, activities, to get them to take kind of an active processing approach to understanding this theory. Because I think it's really exciting and interesting, I have to say. And it makes sense of all the garbage that's talked about, digital disruption. It's like sort of moving from the pub talk to something a little bit more substantial and useful for students. Then we went into the case study, and this was also when we used multiple choice questions available on Moodle in order to get students to process their learning. And we also introduced this theoretical framework for interdepartmental conflict from that article by Schutz and Blocks I mentioned. So there's quite a lot to do, and it always depresses me when students in feedback say, I was doing 2 other modules at the same time, because I'm not sure how available for all this great stuff they were, even though we were scrupulous in our adherence to the study hours we were allowed to use, if you like. But anyway, some of them, as I say, did tuck into it and got benefit from it. And alongside all of this, they were doing the red bits. They were writing the part 1 of their EMA. This is the early verification piece. But for reasons which I won't go into, we couldn't actually have that as a formal part of the submitted EMA. It's to do with the timescale of EMA turnaround. So we had to get them to submit that on the study planner as an ICMA, in fact, a free text ICMA. Caused a lot of head scratching, that did. This is the real excitement of the module, as I see it. From weeks 8 and 9, we actually used the Moodle workshop tool. And for this, they'd already drafted part of EMA, their part 2 of the EMA through a number of activities, guiding them how to do it. And then they submitted their drafts for peer review using the workshop tool. And the great thing about the workshop tool is we could actually set up formal criteria, which in fact we had anticipated in the activities here. So they were coming to these formal criteria, if you like, as an endpoint rather than a starting point, having understood through the activities why they had emerged from the instructions in the assessment material. So they submitted their part 2 drafts, and then they got them back with comments from peers. And one of the most rewarding things about the presentation just ended of the module is what people said about this, how it made them look at their tutor in a new light because they never understood what the poor old tutor had to go through. And I think it did actually get them to mature in their view of assessment as well. I remember one student early on, when they discovered the horror of what was going to happen, they said, well, if we get bad feedback from the assessment, in other words, if that then taints how we develop part 2, might we fail the module? I said, no, it's not like that. I'm trying to get away from the idea, much cherished by students, and I fear some tutors as well, I have been a tutor in the past, that assessment is a kind of a game that you play. And you're not really allowed to know yourself how well you're doing. It's just at the whim of your tutor, if you can please them. Because I'm trying to replace that with a more mature informed judgment approach to assessment, whereby the students would understand why the piece of work they were turning in was really good or not so good, because they understood what the criteria were. So the final part of the module just leaves them to their own devices to get on with planning and writing the rest of the assessment, which is about really their own organisation's response to the opportunities and challenges presented by the digital economy, bringing in concepts that they have got from the MOOCs and also concepts from the course itself. I won't go into a great deal of detail here. I'll just the slides are available. We can talk about them later on. I want to end with the final question: is it working? I don't know. Is the answer. I think it's still too early. It's now in the third presentation. Is this module? The MOOCs have been available since 2016, and they are meant to be available until 2020. So they go through 12 runs. I can't remember how many presentations that implies for the assessment module. My math is not that good because I'm only a marketer. But it has been disappointing, let's say, that we haven't seen any missionary effect. Only 2 of the students that have taken any of the 3 presentations have not already been registered MBA students. God bless them, our MBA students have sniffed a bargain and piled in. And why shouldn't they? I mean, we thought about could we make it only available to new students, and the advice was that would be too complex and it would be against the spirit of the Open University. And anyway, here's U810, which has been available for years, and nobody seems to be taking it up, even though it's a bargain and it's available to existing MBA students if they want. We've also had incredible headaches. Student registration have had incredible headaches, as have we, with trying to work out how many students who have registered for each presentation are actually in possession of the appropriate qualifications to allow them to progress onto it. They see it, they're time poor, our students, they see it on the Study at OU website, they like the idea of it. It does sound quite sassy, I think. You know, it's digital, it's modern, it's about MOOCs. So they register, and it's only when we then reactively check with them, well, have you got these certificates of achievement? We discover they don't. So what looks like quite a lot of students in the pipeline suddenly diminishes into very few very often. And the answer to that might be to take it offline. But the downside of that is that would make us less global in our offer. So I think that's something we would do with some caution, if we did it at all. In terms of evidence about whether it's working, well, certainly the pass rate for the past 2 presentations, which are the only ones that got as far as the assessment, have been very encouraging. I certainly see in forum discussions, as I mentioned earlier, new perspectives on assessment and the role of their tutors, and indeed what assessment itself is about, from comments they make in the forums. They're very, you know, they like talking to each other, these students, and some of them are quite busy on the forums. They don't have a tutor, so in a sense they have to offer each other a certain amount of peer support. I've also seen evidence that they're very enthusiastic about 2 things about the Future Learn MOOCs. One is the vivid learning experience they get, or I say here learner experience, because I'm not quite sure how much learning goes on, but it's certainly a very, very vivid experience. You get, you know, it's very, very attractive, great videos. I'm very proud actually of the audio-visual material that we've managed to generate for them. And they're also really keen on how up-to-date and modern the perspectives are. The idea, my idea was to kind of try and contextualize fairly vanilla MBA concepts in a digital environment, because I wanted these new learners that we were hoping to attract to come then into the MBA and to be able to recognize some of the concepts that they've been encountering in the MOOCs and feel at home. And actually, some learners, in the comments they've made, have expressed disappointment, in a sense, at the familiarity of the theoretical concepts they encountered in the MOOCs, and a regret that there wasn't more digital economy content. I must admit, I myself am disappointed at that reaction, because I felt that the technological change and the disruption literature that we were exposing them to was actually pretty sophisticated and gives quite a good handle as a general way of analysing what's going on in the digital economy. One student revealed in his SEAM qualitative feedback that he had been attracted to the module. This was an existing MBA student because of its bargain element. But in retrospect, he felt that the lack of a tutor had been a constraint. And this is in spite of the fact that the tutor, or the learning advisor that we've used on the last couple of presentations, is an experienced tutor. In many ways, has actually acted as a tutor rather than a learning advisor, although we've been in constant dialogue to try and make sure he minimises his input so that the students aren't getting more than they're paid for, in a sense. And he's not working more than he's paid for. But I think connected to that was concern at less than explicit assessment requirements. It's very, very difficult to write complete, I find as an experienced academic still, it's very, very difficult to write completely lucid assessments that students understand as you understand from the word go. You do occasionally have to have some kind of human intervention as a tutor explains it or deals with their anxious questions. SEAM data for the 17J presentations just come in. I'm not sharing it with you because I'm a bit sceptical at the moment. First of all, there are only 12 respondents, which makes it 25% response rate. And of those respondents, 3 of them made qualitative comments about the module which couldn't possibly have applied to this module. So somehow the information's got a bit jumbled up. So in a sense, I've only got 9 usable responses. So I have to say the student satisfaction is not enormous. If what Bart Rientes was telling us last night about the relationship between satisfaction and retention, or satisfaction and achievement, isn't very reliable, then perhaps these students can be expected to be doing very well. But I think because they were existing MBA students, they came into this module expecting it to be like an MBA module. So some of them, for example, didn't even start looking at it until 3 weeks in. And suddenly thought, my God, there's a deadline. Ah! So we had a real problem with that relatively early. It's not incredibly early, but relatively early deadline. So from the verification thing. In terms of outlook, I still think it's got a lot going for it, this pattern. There's potential. It's potentially positive in its effect on retention and progression because of the warm feelings that those learners were expressing about their MOOCs experience. I think there's a potential slow burn, and FutureLearn may give us a route to international students that we haven't had before because of the radically international reach of the platform. Student registration told me something I hadn't realised, which is that a lot of students want something to do between modules. And they see this as an ideal, relatively low-cost way of keeping their educational plate spinning. So they'll do the MOOCs and think about doing the assessment module. And I was very interested in that because I hadn't seen that as a way of using it. And finally, I think we could reposition it to put more of an emphasis on the online MBA.
Thank you, Terry. Really interesting. I've got many questions, but we've only got 5 minutes for questions, so I'm going to open to the floor. If not, can I ask a question?
Please do.
What happened to the students who took the exams, didn't sign up with us, but they got the credit? What were they doing in their lives, and why did they sign up for the credit? Do you know at all? And that's a big question, but
let me just try and clarify my understanding of the question. The students qualified for certificates of achievement within the MOOCs. So that was done in a way which, what the certificate of achievement requires is a minimum level of participation. So for example, they have to view 90% of the content. They have to show that they've actually done that, tick the boxes. And they also have to score 70% or more in any multiple choice tests that are offered them. So it's not a very high stakes requirement. It's more, I would see it more as a case of being sure that when they come to be assessed by us for what I would call proper master's level assessment with all its rigour, that they've got a fighting chance because they have at least demonstrated that they've read the material, that they're coming to us with some kind of preparation, even though I've devoted some of the time in the MOOC, in the assessment modules to them consolidating and revising that learning. In terms of what happens to students that might have bought the certificates of achievement but don't come to us, they will use those certificates of achievement as, if you like, credentials rather than credit in terms of things like enhancing their CVs or their LinkedIn profiles. And there is evidence that many employers are very happy with these things, and it's making me wonder what the future is for the kind of formal, very expensive, very long-term commitment that we expect students to make in a university education, because it's going to make them more employable.
Thank you.
Just to add on to that, is that I work in executive education on the 2 days I'm not doing what Terry used to do on the open media building. And so the other side to that is, although people, I think employers are, or people are saying that they're looking to use it as credentials, I still have conversations with people that say, oh, so if they're doing this for a badge, is that an OU badge? They still want the blessing of the hand on the head of the university. And I think there's something in there that still needs to be, we need to be explicit really about what you are getting when you get your badge or your certificate. It's not, you're not getting a degree, you're not getting something that counts towards a degree unless you do the assessment part of it.
Well, this is what makes me uncomfortable even with words like certificate.
Yeah.
Because in a university context we know exactly what it means. In an open learning context it's a lot less clear. And our crest is on certificates of achievement. And the university secretary has signed each of those certificates of achievement, or a facsimile of his signature is on them. So it does carry our imprimatur. And in a sense that's a good thing. I mean, research suggests that if a MOOC is endorsed by a professional body, or if it has the stamp and the origin from a reputable university, it's going to attract more learners in what can be a very, very variable market. And it's interesting to note too that there are quality standards emerging for MOOCs and quality accreditation schemes emerging for MOOCs, in much the same way as there are for traditional universities. I mean, the regrettable thing, like, is the revolutionary kind of innovation of the early days of MOOCs is being eroded as MOOC platforms become more and more like online universities. And so this kind of potential kind of trajectory I see in the future is for the Open University, for example, and FutureLearn to converge at some point, because that's the way FutureLearn is heading, along with many other MOOC platforms, and that I suspect is the way that the university is heading, with a kind of a sense of it needs to be a pure digital play to attract the kind of global students that we need to sustain ourselves.
I think that's a good point for us to stop, because we have to vacate this room. It's going to be used again, so I'm so sorry to bring this to such an abrupt end. But thank you very much. It's given us a lot of food for thought. Thank you.